5 Things to Know About Native Son by Richard Wright. Number 1, fear is a force that drives the novel. I think it would be wrong, in fact, to say, oh, fear is one of the themes of Richard Wright's Native Son. Would be, I think, a wrong thing to say, because it's a force in the novel. It's not a theme. It's a thing that drives the novel in a way that's different from it just being a thematically treated thing. Fear and its partner, hatred, are forces that just absolutely drive this novel, and not just for Bigger, for all kinds of characters.
But it's interesting as well that his response to fear is to turn to the example of a group built on hatred. So it really is that the two are very much matched. So Bigger is forced into the job with the Daltons out of fear of what might happen to him if he doesn't get that job, and each decision that he makes thereafter is driven by fear of what people might think of him if they know things or don't know certain things about him.
He fears his own feelings at the same time, and if he acts out his own feelings, he sort of counteracts their point of view of him, as their scope is on him at the same time.
So there's a problem that he's got with having internalized these external views of him and taken them on as part of his own feelings, when really intrinsically they shouldn't be part of his own feelings.
There's a fine line between Bigger's perception of his actions, whether he's driven by fear and whether he's driven by pride in concealing what he's done to Mary.
But he only chooses to show certain sides of himself, right? And it's through the scope of fear, and then in a links with blindness of the others, because they don't know that he's selectively not choosing to show these certain feelings, and then that becomes a product of the fate that he has, because he's going along with the fate that he has because of the fear that he cannot act anything beyond that. And that is the sort of, it becomes sort of like stereotype, and it becomes a cycle.
And he decides to go along and act as the meek boy once he's committed the murder, the accidental murder, because that's the stereotype that he's been brought up to live by.
Yeah, great, thanks. Number 2, economics and politics govern relationships. Rowan.
So capitalism versus communism, so the economic problems, I just wrote a note form, so economic problems within society, especially black people experiencing poverty, and how communism is a way to alleviate those problems at the end.
Or at least a potential way to alleviate those, Because there's a question about Max at the end, whether he's really seen what he needs or not. Cassie.
Because of their economic condition, people are restricted to become themselves. For example, the living condition especially. Bigger says they were always too close to him, so close that he could never have any way of his own. So it kind of shows how the economic situation impinges on his personal growth. And the second thing is how capitalism is this invisible force that dictates how people end up within that society.
Thank you.
Peggy does that as well. When she says, the last guy was here for 20 years. As if to say, you're going to be here for 20 years as well. And again, with that time, the fact that this all happens over a very short period of time, and already Peggy's thinking way down the future.
But she lives in a world where people are able to do that as well, right? So she's surrounded by people who are able to say, we'll get a degree now, we'll go to this school now, and in 20 years' time we'll have this job. He just doesn't have the opportunity to do that. The urgency is too prominent for that to be a possibility. But then what Mr. Dalton does say is he tells him how to spend the money he earns. So he's like, keep 5, give 22 months so that she can send your brother and sister to school, presumably with the idea that in 20 years' time they can then carry on paying me the rent that you have to pay me now. So it's all, it's really time dependent.
Okay, number 3, mass media shape and control societal perception of Bigger. Marie.
Society is inundated with media portrayals of the black community, and Bigger is so overwhelmed by this that he acts out that image that he's told he is.
Thanks. Jenna?
It's an impression of Bigger is created to those that are so far removed from him that they wouldn't know any different. So it kind of codifies the belief of the white people that have no relationship and no other perception of Bigger.
Particularly with the idea of like film and cinema and newspapers as well, actually, they're almost, the society's being told that they should fear this sort of black community, but they're not necessarily told why. And ultimately, it's like a vicious circle that the white community emphasises or makes the black experience of the city so awful that black people are forced to act the way they do, and then when the whites fear that, they're fearing something that they've created. So it's sort of like a vicious circle that they can't seem to see, which again sort of relates to the idea of blindness, and they're blind to their own actions and how their own actions are creating this like sort of atmosphere of fear and hatred. And so it's just sort of an endless cycle that they can't seem to break free of.
Great. Number 4, blindness is a key and complex motif in the novel. Safia.
So the novel is constantly switching perspectives, whether that be limited or as a whole. So you follow Bigger's perspective as an individual with kind of the absolute knowledge and the short-sightedness he perceives on the rest of the characters, which widens out towards the end of the novel with communism, but then is shrunk back down again with the realization that he is never fully understood.
Kareem?
So blindness is a key and complex motif due to the fact that if we only follow Bigger's perspective in the grand scheme of things, we only get to see how he chooses to show people the different sides of himself. So in the construct of his own identity, people don't always get to see what we get to see, and thus he becomes an eluded perspective as a representative or an individual.
And they also don't understand their own role, and they're blind to their own role in creating those forces that force him to create his identity against them.
Which is driven by fear as well.
Which is also driven by fear.
Yeah.
Number 5, Bigger needs to be understood both as an individual and as representative. Rachel.
It's ultimately the view of Bigger as a representative that brings about the inevitability of the course of the novel, suggesting that course is the inevitable outcome for anybody that society perceives to be like Bigger. So the way that like for so long these headlines are just announced without actually naming him, there's a vagueness in it that sort of lets him be representative of that sort of lifestyle. I'm wondering as well if the idea of him as emblematic goes back to that objectification, because the point at which he starts to question the boundary between the individual and the representative, he says, well, the narrative says, why should he have felt the need to try and make his feelings known? And why did he not hear the echoes of his feelings in the hearts of others? So it's the feelings. And it's the point at which he realises that there's an emotional side to it and not just the objectification of it that makes him stop being able to consider himself as representative. That there has to be an individualism in it because he can feel something, not just that he stands for it.
So when he says at the end, I don't need a cross to die, he asserts his individuality and he's dying for himself. But regardless of whether he dies as an individual or as a representative, his death doesn't change anything.
Yeah, he's literally not the savior of anybody, including himself. And this moment where he says, I don't need a cross to die, in that he's an individual who's dying only because of his individual acts, and yet those individual acts all come about because he's viewed in a society, or he has to function in a society that views him not as an individual but as a representative for ill or good of his race. I think the final thing to say about all of these 5 things that are important to know about Native Son is that it's very difficult to separate any one of them from another. Each one of these things is part of a collective relationship with the other, and it's what really makes the novel a rich novel, a complex novel, and still a valuable novel, a real living examination of our current hour in Chicago in particular, in America more generally, in the world more generally, with something to say about the situation we find ourselves in socially, culturally, in 2018 as it does from the time that it was written.